The kayak is coming along. There's still a fair bit to do. I'm going to need a paddle for it, and this one just won't do. So I'll make one in this video and then I'll get back to the kayak then. I'll use this old reclaimed cedar board. It doesn't match the Australian red cedar that I used on the kayak. I don't have any more of that, but this Western red cedar will still look great, and it doesn't need to match the kayak anyway, and it will probably look better that it doesn't. I'm using the instructions in this book by Nick Sharder from Guillemot Kayaks. He also has plans available on his website, and I'll put a link in the description. I'll start by cutting the shaft of the paddle, which will be in 2 pieces. The reason it's in 2 pieces is the paddle will get feathered, where one blade will be angled away from the other one, and they'll be joined together later on with the scarf joint. Next, I'll cut the pieces that will make up the blades of the paddle. Before I glue these pieces to the shaft, I'll taper the ends of the shaft first. It isn't necessary, but it does look good and it will look better than just straight. My tapering jig isn't really a jig at all. It's just a piece of plywood that I screw a fence to, which is also just a piece of plywood, and then drill holes through where I need to put the clamps. I did have a proper jig, but I lost it somewhere along the way. I really don't know how, but this works just as well anyway. I cut a couple of strips of camphor laurel off camera, and these are to use as accent strips, so I'll glue those onto the blanks and then they'll be ready to cut the blades out of on the bandsaw. While the glue's setting on those, I'll cut a scarf joint on the shafts. I've marked the start of the scarf, which I'll cut using the taper jig again. One piece will be upright and the other one will be cut lying down. Also, to make the joint even more strange, I'll tilt the table saw blade over by 15 degrees, which when the joint comes together will give the paddle a 60-degree feather, or in other words 60 degrees difference between each blade. It really is a very odd looking joint and it doesn't come together neatly at all, but there should be enough material there to shape the shaft and blend the 2 halves together. Now I'll put that aside and I'll get back to the blades. Next, I'll make a template out of plywood to mark out the curve of the blade. I need 2 pieces for either end of the paddle, and I'll get 2 out of each blank. Before I glue them on, I'll remove part of the tapered end of the shaft to match. I could just carve it out after they've been glued, but this way will make it easier. Because I need a waterproof glue, all the glue I'm using in this project is Type Bond 3. To shape the concave side of the blades, I've glued 40 grit sandpaper to the matching offcut, and this sanded it down in no time at all. That side was easy enough, so next I'll start the back, which has a bit more to it. The blades are pretty thick at the moment, and eventually I will get them down to under 1/8 of an inch, but first I'm just getting them even across the blade. Next I made a template to cut the blade shape out, and I used this cheap paddle as a starting point, and then I did adjust it to look more like the one in the book. Now I'll start rounding over the shaft so then I can carve the transition of the shaft into the blade. I'm using a round over bit on the router table, and this will give me a starting point, but the shaft will eventually be shaped into an oval shape. I could have power carved the back of the blade, but instead I've decided to use hand tools, starting with the block plane and then gouges, and I'll use a gouge to blend the shaft into the blade. I really enjoyed this part of the project, and it's much more pleasant than power carving. I'm trying to carve the transition more into the blade and then leave as much material as I can on the shaft. The grain on the blade is running against the grain of the shaft and making it tricky to carve, but sandpaper on a stick does a great job of finishing off the transition. I keep working away at the blade, thinning it out and checking it as I go. That's starting to get there. Next I'll refine the outside shape, starting with the disc sander. There's one done. Now for the other one, and that one didn't take too long at all as I'd already done one and I knew what I was doing. I did some more sanding on each blade, thinning them out a touch more. Now it's time to glue the scarf joint together, and first I'll do a dry fit and make some marks to help line it up. The tape is just there to hold it together while I get clamps on it. I'm checking it straight and making adjustments, and after a few minutes I removed the clamps and shrink wrapped it, and that's to get a really good even clamp on it. I left it overnight, then unwrapped it and started to blend the two halves using a block plane. Even though the joint looked very odd and I had my doubts, but it did blend together well. Now I'll keep shaping the shaft, making it more oval so it'll have a better fit in the hand. I didn't catch it on camera, but while I was sanding it, I broke the scarf joint in two. I cleaned the surfaces and I'll re-glue them, but this time I've decided to use epoxy. I'll mix in an additive to thicken up the epoxy into more of a glue-like consistency. I actually left the first glue up just about 24 hours, so I'm not sure quite what happened there. The only thing I can think of is the shrink wrap may have prevented the glue from setting properly. It's moving around and there's no way these clamps are going to work, so I'll shrink wrap them again, and this actually pulled the joint together and pretty well lined it up perfectly. While that's setting, I'll move on to dressing it up, and for that I'm using Usagi veneers from a block I made a year or two ago. I'll take plain shaving veneers off the block and glue them to the paddles. If you want to see how I made the block and more detail about Usagi, I'll put a link above. This block was far from perfect and there's a few splits, but it's all still there, and ironing it flat will make most of it usable. I'll sand the blade a bit smoother and then glue on the Usagi. I'm using the better part of the veneer and then discarding the rest and then taking a good part from another to finish it. I'm using a piece of foam board to clamp down on the veneer until it tacks off. The foam board will add a fairly even pressure across the surface, and it has a very shiny side that the glue won't stick to, otherwise I could have covered it with packing tape. I took the clamps off after about 10 minutes and let the glue set. It's not perfect, but I reckon it still looks great. It's time to unwrap the scarf joint again, and this time I'm very confident that it bonded well. After sanding the joint smooth, I went over the whole thing ready for fiberglassing. Because I can control the heat better in my metal workshop, I'll be doing the fiberglassing in there. With the force that will be put on the blades, there's nowhere they'll be strong enough without fiberglass. The shaft doesn't need fiberglass though, that will be plenty strong enough as it is, even though I didn't actually use the strongest wood for it. I'll be paddling fairly leisurely though, so I think it'll be fine. After wetting the cloth out, I'll scrape off the excess so the cloth is pressed against the wood, which will give it plenty of strength. Later on, I'll give the whole thing a couple of coats of epoxy, so I'll do the centre section now, and when that's dry I can move the sawhorses in and I can coat the rest of it. After a couple of hours I came back and I brushed on a coat of epoxy to fill in the weave of the cloth. After another 6 hours, I came back and trimmed up the edges. I cleaned all those up, sanded it, and gave it another coat of epoxy. And that will give me plenty of epoxy to work with and sand the whole thing down smooth. I started sanding with 120 grit, then went to 180 and finished at 240. And for the finish, I'll be using water-based varnish, and that will end up getting 5 or 6 coats. It's pretty cool how fiberglass can strengthen wood and opens up all sorts of possibilities. It's been a fun project, and I reckon the paddle will go much better with my kayak than the old one I showed at the start of the video, and it weighs at just 730 grams. Hopefully the finished kayak won't be too far away, and hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.